On the morning of June 11th, 2006, the sun rose over the cornfields of Shallow Creek, Indiana, without anyone noticing the silence inside the old lake farmhouse. It was a small white structure with peeling paint and a sagging front porch, the kind of house that had been standing longer than most of the people still living in the area. Mildred Lake, 72, had lived there nearly her entire life. She raised 2 sons in that house, buried her husband a few miles down the road, and kept to her routines like clockwork. Breakfast at 6:30, chores by 7, phone call to her granddaughter Claire every Sunday before church. But that morning, Claire's call rang and rang until it went to the answering machine. That wasn't like Mildred. Not ever. By 10 a.m., Claire had called again. Then again. At noon, she drove 30 miles out from Fort Wayne. When she pulled into the long gravel drive, she knew something was off. The barn doors were open, but the truck hadn't moved. The house was unlocked, but no one answered. Inside, the kitchen was quiet. A plate sat on the table, scrambled eggs, toast, a half-drunk cup of tea, still warm. A tea towel was draped neatly over the sink, and the back door was closed but not locked. The only thing missing was Mildred. Claire searched the house for nearly 20 minutes before calling her uncle, Dennis Lake, who lived on the edge of town. He arrived with little urgency, brushing off the worry. Maybe their mother had gone for a walk. Maybe she went to a neighbor's. But Claire knew better. Mildred didn't leave the house without her purse, her keys, or her hat. All of those were still there. The Sunday paper was unopened on the porch. Her walking stick leaned against the doorframe. Her shoes, the ones she always wore when she went outside, were neatly placed by the back step. By late afternoon, the Shallow Creek Sheriff's Department was on site. Deputy Karen Fields took the initial report. No sign of forced entry, no indication of a break-in, no overturned furniture, no blood. Nothing that looked like a struggle. It looked like she'd simply stood up in the middle of breakfast and vanished. They started with the obvious. A missing persons report was filed by 6 p.m., and local volunteers gathered by dusk to comb the woods behind the property. Search dogs were brought in, and for the first few hours there was hope. They followed a faint trail for less than a mile before losing the scent entirely. The ground was hard and dry from an early summer heat wave. No tracks, no disturbed soil, no discarded clothing, nothing. Mildred's scent stopped cold near the tree line. The dog circled and whined, then sat. That night, Claire stayed on the couch with the porch light on, just in case. Dennis went home. He said he'd come back in the morning. He didn't. The next day, investigators expanded the search perimeter and checked with nearby hospitals. Nothing. No Jane Does admitted, no sightings, no traffic. Camera hits. The farmhouse's landline had no outgoing calls after the day before. Her bank account hadn't been touched. The fridge still held leftovers from Friday. Even the laundry basket was full, as if she was planning to do it that afternoon. By day 3, the case was already shifting. What had started as a routine missing person, an elderly woman possibly confused or disoriented, began to feel less like a disappearance and more like something else. But with no physical evidence, no witnesses, and no sign of a crime, detectives could only speculate. The fact that she was last seen eating breakfast suggested she hadn't been taken during the night. No one in the neighborhood had seen any unusual vehicles, no tire tracks in the gravel besides Claire's, and no one had heard anything. Just silence. The local news ran a small segment on Mildred's disappearance, an old photo of her from a church potluck, hair pulled into a bun, soft smile, hands clasped around a plate of deviled eggs. "Community pillar missing," the headline read. But after a week, the coverage faded. The leads dried up, and the town moved on. By month's end, all that remained was an empty chair at a dinner table and a lingering question no one could answer. How does a woman vanish from inside her own home in broad daylight without leaving a trace? There were whispers, of course. Maybe she wandered off and fell into a ravine. Maybe she had a secret no one knew about. Maybe someone knew more than they were saying. The sheriff's office officially listed her as endangered missing, but off the record, most believed foul play. They just couldn't prove it. Inside the farmhouse, nothing changed. Her bedroom stayed exactly as it was. Her closet, untouched, mail piled up on the counter. A layer of dust began forming on the piano keys, and in the attic, sealed behind an old door that no one could quite remember opening, the air grew stale. But no one looked there. Not yet. Because no one believed a missing woman could be so close. Not until years later, when a new discovery would force the town to remember the day everything went quiet. The farmhouse on Willow Road wasn't just a house, it was a time capsule. 3 generations of the Lake family had lived under its roof, their lives layered into every inch of the space. Quilts that Mildred's mother had stitched still hung on the upstairs railing. A china cabinet full of chipped dishes from the Great Depression stood in the corner of the dining room. And in the back pantry, a shelf of canned peaches bore faded labels marked 1989. To outsiders, the house felt like something preserved, not neglected, but not modernized either. It was Mildred's world, carefully kept, predictably ordered. That made what happened inside it, or what didn't, all the more unsettling. After Mildred's disappearance, detectives treated the house as a potential crime scene, though it didn't behave like one. There was no broken glass, no muddy footprints, no ransacked drawers. Just a strange stillness, like the air hadn't moved in days. Forensic techs spent hours combing through the interior, collecting fibers, lifting prints, checking for blood with luminol, but the results came back clean. There were no unknown fingerprints, no DNA hits, no signs of violence. It was like she had vanished from a place untouched by anyone else. That absence of evidence didn't bring comfort. It made things worse. Deputy Fields returned 3 times in the first week, hoping something would stand out if she looked again with fresh eyes. She opened every drawer, every cupboard, checked the trash bins, the basement, even the woodpile outside. Each time she paused in front of the attic door. It was a narrow wooden panel at the top of the back staircase, just beyond the linen closet. And it was sealed shut, not locked, but latched from the inside. That detail bothered her. Attics didn't latch inward, not usually. She tried the knob. It turned, but the latch wouldn't give. Dennis, who had joined her on one of the walkthroughs, shrugged it off, said it had been that way since he was a kid. Ma always said it was just a drafty storage space, he told her. I don't think anyone's been up there in years. Fields noted it, but didn't press. The structure didn't show signs of tampering, no smells, no unusual heat signatures. They assumed the latch had been shut long ago and forgotten. Mildred's scent didn't lead there. The dogs had never barked toward the ceiling. It became a non-lead, one of dozens. The home's floorboards creaked familiarly, like old wood should. There were no signs of stress or sudden impact, no scratches, drag marks, or blood, no entry points that led anywhere other than back outside. The kitchen window was slightly cracked but locked. The back screen had a tear, but it was old, frayed. Nothing pointed to a break-in, forced removal, or secret passage. Even the family safe, a rusted steel box under the bed, still held Mildred's birth certificate, the deed to the farm, and $600 in 5s and 10s wrapped in wax paper. They searched her room for diaries, journals, anything that might explain her state of mind. There was nothing beyond a few to-do lists written on grocery store receipts, feed hens, fix screen, call Claire. They examined her medications, blood pressure pills, joint supplements, a bottle of melatonin that was mostly full, all prescribed, all current, all untouched since the day before she disappeared. Some thought maybe she'd had a stroke, wandered off disoriented, but the search radius was wide and the ground was clear. If she'd collapsed nearby, she would have been found. The idea of a planned disappearance didn't fit either. There were no travel bags packed, no signs she had been preparing for anything at all. Even her coat still hung by the door, with a grocery list in the pocket and a peppermint candy in the lining. It didn't feel like someone preparing to vanish. It felt like someone expecting to finish breakfast and feed the chickens. Claire walked through the house slowly, day after day, touching things her grandmother had once touched. The crocheted armrest covers, the ceramic lamp shaped like a cat, the plate of costume jewelry near the mirror. She said the house smelled the same, like cedar, linoleum, and something faintly floral. Nothing in it gave her answers. just silence. Neighbors were interviewed. None had seen Mildred that day, but most described her as active, healthy, careful. No one reported visitors, suspicious cars, or strange sounds. The mail carrier said she waved at him the day before. The pastor at her church said she was planning to bring pies to the potluck that Sunday. None of it lined up with someone planning to disappear. After the second week, police scaled back the investigation. No new leads, no fresh evidence, and no reason to believe a crime had occurred inside the house. Technically, Mildred was still a missing person, not a victim. That distinction mattered on paper, even if it didn't in people's hearts. Dennis moved back into the house for a few months, then left again. Said it was too painful. Claire visited less often. Eventually, the grass grew tall, the paint peeled further, and the attic stayed latched. No one thought to revisit it. Not then. Because you don't search inside something you've already decided is empty. And you don't unseal doors you've already convinced yourself are dead ends. But some doors don't stay shut forever. And years later, that attic would prove it was never as forgotten as people wanted to believe. In a town like Shallow Creek, stories have long shadows. Long after the flyers were taken down and the searches stopped, the whispers kept going, not in police reports or press releases, but over coffee in diners, under breath in church pews, behind gas station counters. Not everyone believed Mildred Lake had just vanished. Some thought it had been building for years, that the house on Willow Road had always carried a certain weight, not just from history, but from something unspoken. People remembered Raymond Lake, Mildred's late husband, with a mix of respect and discomfort. He died in 1993, but his reputation never really left. Tall, silent, hard-handed. He farmed during the day and drank alone at night. In the 70s, there were rumors he ran bootleg liquor out of a barn on the back edge of the property. Dry counties nearby made it a profitable side job. But what people really remembered were the fights. Shouting through open windows, things thrown in the yard, Mildred showing up at church with a bruised wrist or a cut above her eye, always covered in powder, always explained away with just a fall. No one asked too much. No one called the sheriff. In those days, you didn't. The whispers came. Back after her disappearance. People said maybe it didn't end when Raymond died. Maybe it just shifted. Mildred's only surviving son, Dennis, had always been off. Not criminal, not violent publicly, just odd, reclusive. He dropped out of high school his junior year and never really worked after that. Lived in the farmhouse with Mildred for over a decade after his father passed. Kept to himself, never married, no close friends. Some said he didn't drive anywhere unless he had to. Others said he didn't talk to people at all unless they talked first. He was polite when questioned, but distant. Told police he'd last seen his mother the day before she vanished. Said they had breakfast, went over a grocery list, and that he left to help a neighbor fix a tractor. That neighbor confirmed the story. Phone records backed up his call. His fingerprints were everywhere, but that wasn't unusual. It was his home, too. Still, something about him unsettled people. Maybe it was the way he talked about her disappearance, not with grief, but with vague frustration. Claire would later say it was like he felt inconvenienced, more than heartbroken. He didn't help in the search. He didn't put up flyers. When reporters showed up once, he told them to leave. "She'll come back when she's ready," he said, and closed the door. Privately, Claire began to wonder. She remembered things differently than she had before. Arguments between her grandmother and uncle that she'd overheard as a child, but never understood at the time. Once, years earlier, she'd seen Mildred walking stiffly, wincing when she sat down. She blamed arthritis. Another time, Claire spotted a split lip, and Mildred said she'd tripped on the porch step. It seemed plausible then. Looking back, it didn't feel right. But there were no reports, no paper trail, just hunches and hindsight. The police questioned Dennis multiple times. He never wavered. He signed every form, gave every fingerprint, even let them look through his personal things. The only things they found were piles of old newspapers, dozens of unopened letters, and a shoebox of cassette tapes labeled by year. None of it was suspicious, just odd. The attic was brought up again, briefly. but the original report noted the inward latch. Officers assumed if Dennis had done something wrong, he wouldn't have drawn attention to that door. And since the dogs hadn't reacted, they moved on. By fall, investigators had shifted focus. Tips led nowhere. The case sat in a cold file cabinet with dozens of others across the state, cases that were missing but not clearly criminal. For Claire, the waiting settled into a kind of silent panic. She visited the house less. Every time she did, Dennis seemed more withdrawn. He didn't ask about new leads, didn't mention the flyers, just went about his day, quiet as always. In town, some people started calling the farmer. Others just lowered their voices when the lake name came up. There was no funeral, no memorial, no closure. Just Mildred's name, printed once a year in the missing persons bulletin and slowly fading from conversation. Still, every now and then, someone would bring up a story. How Raymond once got into a fight behind the feed store, how Dennis was suspended in 8th grade for threatening a teacher, how Mildred used to flinch when people raised their voices. None of it added up to evidence, but it was enough to stain my memory. Enough to make people wonder if the truth had been buried a long time ago, not in the woods or a shallow grave, but in silence, in routine, in the kind of fear that hides in plain sight. And it was enough that when the house passed into Claire's hands nearly 2 decades later, that attic door, still latched, still unexplained, would no longer seem harmless. The days after Mildred Lake disappeared stretched into weeks, and those weeks into something heavier, the kind of time that weighs down everyone left behind. But in those first critical days, the town of Shallow Creek moved as one. Volunteers came in from surrounding counties. Farmers parked their tractors at the edge of the road and joined search lines that combed the tree line, cornfields, irrigation ditches, and overgrown fence lines. Old wells were reopened. Abandoned barns were unlocked for the first time in years. People walked shoulder to shoulder, hoping the ground would give them something. A footprint, a thread, a sign that someone had gone this way. The Shallow Creek Fire Department set up a command tent across the road from the farmhouse. Maps were taped to folding tables. Search grids were marked with colored pins. Cadaver dogs were brought in by day 3. They sniffed through brush and old hunting trails, pausing now and then, as if catching something, then moving on with nothing to hold on to. One dog lingered near the back barn, but nothing was found. The barn was empty, half collapsed, roof buckled. Investigators sifted through animal bones, old tools, and piles of rotting hay. Nothing pointed to Mildred. They brought in drones, basic ones, the kind hobbyists used, but good enough for thermal imaging. Ponds were dragged twice. Divers found rusted tools, broken fencing, even a child's bicycle from decades earlier, but not her. A neighbor allowed crews to dig through his root cellar. Another opened a flooded crawl space. There was a desperation in the effort, one that said, "This isn't just about Mildred anymore. It's about what might be hiding in any of our homes." By the end of the second week, the town had been turned inside out. Every path, ditch, and deer trail within 3 miles of the house had been searched. But the center of the mystery, the house itself, remained unchanged. Dennis was still there, still insisting he didn't know anything, still reluctant to let anyone stay too long inside. He gave access when asked, but hovered, kept doors, half closed, watched people as they walked from room to room. A few volunteers mentioned it quietly, how he seemed more annoyed than afraid, how he never asked, "Have you found her?" By month's end, the volunteer lines thinned. Claire came less often, worn down by grief and unanswered questions. She went back to work, kept her phone close, waited for news that never came. Each tip grew weaker. One woman claimed to see Mildred walking a highway 20 miles west. Police checked surveillance footage. It wasn't her. Another call came from a truck stop, where a cashier said an elderly woman had paid for gas with a trembling hand and left in a white pickup. But the timestamp didn't match, and the plate was never seen again. One day in October, 4 months after Mildred vanished, a group of retired veterans, some who had known the lakes for decades, offered to check the property one more time. They brought ground-penetrating radar. They scanned the yard, the barn. even the crawl space beneath the porch. They noted some irregularities near the east fence, but wrote it off as disturbed earth from an old irrigation trench. No one brought up the attic, not then. No one wanted to reopen a door they'd already deemed irrelevant. Winter came early that year, and with it, the energy drained. The flyers curled on telephone poles, the tip line rang less often, deputies were reassigned, and the case, once so loud in the minds of everyone, began to go quiet. Not forgotten, just unsolved. The kind of silence that turns into resignation, the kind that makes you walk a little faster past the edge of certain properties. By the following spring, Dennis moved out. No formal announcement, just gone. A truck pulled into the drive one morning, and by dusk, he was gone, leaving behind only a few broken chairs, a mattress, and shelves full of unopened food cans. Claire drove out a week later, found the front door unlocked, windows fogged, mold creeping along the bathroom ceiling. The kitchen looked exactly the same as the day her grandmother disappeared. Plates still in the sink, toast crumbs hardened to the counter. She locked the door on her way out and didn't return for nearly a year. Locals noticed. Some said Dennis couldn't handle living where she'd vanished. Others believed something darker, that maybe he left not because of what he didn't know, but because of what he did. They remembered how he avoided the news crews, how he never cried, how he once told a grocery clerk, "Some people just leave. You gotta let them." That line stuck with folks. It didn't sound like grief. It sounded like an excuse. In time, the farmhouse became just another decaying relic on the edge of town. Kids dared each other to walk past it at night. Older residents looked away when driving past. And yet, the house stood. Quiet, sealed. The attic, still latched from the inside. Untouched, unopened, forgotten by most, but not by everyone. Because in Neman, towns like Shallow Creek, stories settle into the walls. And eventually, someone always comes back to listen. In July of 2010, 4 years after Mildred Lake had been declared missing and presumed deceased, Claire found a cream-colored envelope in her mailbox with no return address. It was her birthday, and she hadn't been expecting anything, certainly not something handwritten, with her full name in the kind of cursive only people of a certain age still used. The postmark read, Indianapolis, stamped just 3 days earlier. Inside was a folded card with a bouquet of lilacs on the front, the kind her grandmother used to buy in bulk from the local pharmacy. Inside, the message was short. "Happy birthday, sweetheart. Always proud of you. Love, Grandma." Claire dropped it, not because she believed it was real, not immediately, but because for a second her body reacted faster than her mind. It was the handwriting, the looped G's, the long strokes on the Y's, the way the W in always slanted just slightly left. It was identical to every birthday card Mildred had ever written her since childhood. The ink looked fresh, the paper clean. But her grandmother had been gone for 4 years. She reported it the next morning, brought the envelope to the sheriff's office, where the new deputy in charge of cold cases, Lucas Mallory, logged it as potential evidence. At first, they assumed it had to be some kind of cruel prank, someone who'd gotten hold of old letters, copied the style, and was trying to get attention. But when Mallory compared it to known handwriting samples collected in the original investigation, old shopping lists, a recipe book, signed Christmas cards, he couldn't dismiss it. It matched too closely. The slant, the pressure, the odd way Mildred sometimes dotted her is slightly to the left. It wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to raise serious questions. The return address line was blank. The envelope had been processed through a main facility in Indianapolis, but the postmark traced back to a freestanding public mailbox near a strip mall, the kind without cameras. No usable prints were recovered. The DNA swabbed from the envelope was inconclusive, too degraded, possibly from gloves or mailing contamination. There were no camera feeds, no receipts, just a card that shouldn't exist. 2 months later, another letter came. This time, it wasn't a card, but a full page of lined paper, folded neatly inside a plain envelope with a similar postmark. Again, no return address. The writing was different this time, shakier, but still recognizable. The letter referenced Claire's college graduation, which had happened 3 years earlier, as if it had just occurred. It also mentioned feeding the hens and how the old fence keeps leaning by the peach tree. Mildred hadn't kept hens since 2003. The peach tree had been cut down a year before she vanished. Claire sat in her apartment with the letter in her lap for nearly an hour before calling the sheriff's office again. This time, a forensic linguist was brought in from Indianapolis, someone who specialized in authorship analysis. He examined sentence structure, phrase choices, regional dialect clues. His initial conclusion was inconclusive. The letters were likely written by the same person, but whether that person was Mildred Lake was another matter. Some phrases aligned with her known patterns, others felt off. Not wrong, just off. Like someone who knew her well enough to imitate her, but not quite well enough to make it seamless. Then came the third letter. December, just before Christmas. It was brief and strange. Still snowing here. The roof's leaking again. You should come visit when the weather clears. Love always. No name. Just the same cursive signature. Grandma. Claire's heart twisted when she read it, not because she believed her grandmother was alive, but because part of her wanted to. And part of her feared the alternative, that someone had been watching. Someone who knew details only a family member should. Someone who remembered the roof leak from a storm in '98. Someone who knew Claire's birthday, her address, her memories. Police revisited Dennis, who was now living in a trailer outside of Muncie. He denied everything, said he hadn't sent anything, hadn't seen anything, and didn't care what the letter said. When asked why someone would impersonate Mildred, he said, "People are sick. Always have been. Some of them live next door, and you'd never know." His tone was cold, tired, detached, nothing actionable. Investigators considered the possibility of a hoax, someone inside the family, maybe even Claire herself, but she was cleared quickly. The grief was real, her history clean. She hadn't spoken publicly about the case in years. If anything, she'd gone quiet. The letters brought her back into something she had tried to leave behind. The case file was reopened temporarily, but with no further leads and no new letters. It was closed again 6 months later. The letters were bagged, labeled, and stored with the rest of the original evidence. Claire kept copies in a drawer beside her bed, reading them sometimes when she couldn't sleep. They weren't comforting. If anything, they deepened the ache, because if they were real, it meant Mildred had survived for some time after she disappeared. And if they weren't, it meant someone else had kept her memory alive in a way that felt almost intimate. The truth stayed just out of reach. But what no one could explain, not even the analysts, was how all 3 envelopes had slight musty scents. Not perfume, not soil, something in between, something like cedar and insulation, something that reminded Claire of one place more than anywhere else: the attic. When the call came in the spring of 2022, Claire Lake let it go to voicemail. It wasn't until later that night, after her son had fallen asleep on the couch with a picture book on his chest, that she listened to the message. Dennis Lake had died in a hospice outside Muncie. Complications from liver failure. No next of kin, no spouse, no children. The farmhouse, still in the Lake family trust, would legally pass to her. Claire didn't respond for 2 days. When she finally did, it was with a numb kind of acceptance, not grief, not closure, just inevitability. For the first time in 16 years, the house on Willow Road was hers. She hadn't been back since her early 20s, not really. A few visits, brief and uncomfortable, to collect mail or check on the overgrown lawn. But she'd never stayed. Not after the searches, not after the letters, and never overnight. But now, with Dennis gone and her own life circling a kind of quiet, Claire packed up her 6-year-old son, Dylan, and drove the 2 hours from Fort Wayne to see what had been left behind. The farmhouse stood exactly as she remembered it, only more tired. The porch had sagged deeper, the front door swollen from years of unuse. Vines had crept across the siding like veins, and shingles had slipped loose in a jagged pattern along the roofline. Inside, the air was thick. Old wood, mildew, the sharp bite of dust disturbed. Dylan held her hand tightly. "Is this where Grandma lived?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire nodded. A long time ago. The first few days were mechanical, clearing cobwebs, opening windows that hadn't been touched in over a decade, sorting through boxes Dennis had left behind, newspaper clippings, cassette tapes, stacks of unopened mail. The kitchen was frozen in time, still holding a chipped plate on the counter, still smelling faintly of linoleum and forgotten spice jars. Claire found herself caught between numbness and unease. Every drawer she opened felt like a test, every corner a possible answer she wasn't ready to find. Dylan adjusted quickly. Children do. He made a game of the dust, drew shapes in it with his fingers. He liked the creaking floors, said they talked. Claire laughed half-heartedly. At night she slept lightly on a mattress dragged into the front room, her son beside her, both of them under two thin blankets. The wind outside came in gusts, carrying the groan of tree limbs and the distant clatter of loose barn tin. Inside, the house had its own noises, settling wood, shifting pipes, faint thumps that could have been anything. Claire reminded herself it was just a house, just walls and air. But on the fourth night, Dylan woke her with a whisper. "There's someone upstairs." Claire sat up too fast, heart knocking against her ribs. "What do you mean?" He didn't look scared, just puzzled. "They were walking. I heard them." He pointed upward, toward the ceiling above the parlor. Claire listened. Silence, the kind that presses on the ears. Then, almost too faint to trust, a soft creak. Another. A pause. She stood slowly, picked up the flashlight she'd kept by the sleeping bag, and made her way to the staircase. Dylan followed, bare feet silent on the wood. The second floor was exactly as she remembered it. Narrow hallway, 2 bedrooms, and at the far end, the attic door. It hadn't been opened in years, maybe decades. A thin layer of dust coated the knob, and the faint outline of a latch was still visible, high up near the top of the frame. Claire reached out, heart thudding. The knob turned easily, but the door wouldn't open, still latched, from the inside. She stared at it for a long time. Something about it felt wrong, not threatening, not dramatic, just wrong in the way something unresolved refuses to be forgotten. She knocked once, softly. Nothing. She called Dylan back downstairs, told him it was just old house sounds, nothing to worry about. He nodded, but later that night, he whispered again, "They're still up there." Claire didn't sleep. The next morning she inspected the house again in daylight, checked for rodents, birds, anything that could have made those sounds. She found nothing. No nests, no droppings, no way in or out of the attic except through the door that still wouldn't budge. She stood outside it for nearly 10 minutes listening. The silence behind it felt heavy, not empty, just sealed. She thought of the letters again, the scent of insulation, the way each one seemed to echo memories too specific to be guessed. She thought of the latch, how no one had ever gotten it open, how even during the initial investigation it had been dismissed because there was no sign of anything wrong. But now, standing there as the mother of a child who heard footsteps above their heads, Claire felt something shift. The house no longer felt quiet. It felt aware. And whatever it had held in silence for so long, it hadn't gone anywhere. Claire didn't call the sheriff's department first. She called a contractor named Eli Purnell, who'd done mold remediation at her apartment 2 years prior. Someone she trusted, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. She told him the attic latch was jammed and probably rusted shut, that it hadn't been opened in decades, and that she just needed someone to get it open safely without damaging the frame. He showed up the next afternoon with a crowbar, a headlamp, and a crow's foot pry bar for finer work. What he didn't bring was any sense that he was walking into something that had been sealed for nearly 20 years. It took 15 minutes. The latch had been installed from inside, wedged into a warped board with 3 rusted screws. Once the wood cracked under pressure, the latch released with a sharp ping, and the door creaked open half an inch. Eli hesitated. "You sure you want to be the one to open it?" Claire nodded. She stepped forward, placed her hand on the edge of the door, and pushed. The smell was immediate, stale, dry, but laced with something sour and organic, the scent of insulation, sweat, and slow rot. The beam of the headlamp swept across the space as they stepped in. It wasn't an attic in the usual sense. No exposed beams, no stored Christmas boxes or forgotten trunks. Someone had built a room inside the room, plywood walls erected within the rafters, nailed together unevenly but tightly. A patchwork of old quilts and blankets had been stapled across the boards, covering insulation, muffling sound. It wasn't random, it was intentional. There was a narrow bed frame with a sunken foam mattress, the kind you'd find in an old camper. A thick wool blanket, gray with dust, was still draped over the end. A chipped enamel basin sat in the corner, crusted with something long dried. A rusted thermos, a spoon, a rolled towel used as a pillow. There was no light fixture, no bulb, just a small square vent cut into the far wall, covered with mesh. Claire moved slowly, as if her breath alone might disturb the room's balance. She wasn't ready for what Eli found next. He was checking the insulation in the far corner when he stopped cold, pulled something metallic from behind a loose panel, a small lockbox, old and dented, sealed with a rusted latch. He turned to Claire. This was hidden. She took it in both hands and set it down near the attic entrance. Then Eli looked under the bed. At first it was just a shape, cloth covering something that didn't belong in a place like this. He leaned closer, lifted the edge of the blanket, and froze. Bones, curled into a tight position beneath the bed. Skeletal remains with remnants of faded clothing still clinging to the ribs and hips. Thin, brittle, a jaw partially dislocated, long white hair caught in the fibers of the blanket above. There was no mistaking it. No animal would have been laid out that way. No prank would have felt this heavy. It was a body, or what was left of one, and from the size and clothing, there was only one person it could be. Claire couldn't speak. She stood in the doorway, hand on the frame, feeling her knees begin to shake. 17 years of silence collapsed in an instant. The attic hadn't just been forgotten, it had been sealed, hidden. It hadn't failed to give them answers. They had failed to look close enough. Eli backed out. Claire called 911, and the farmhouse on Willow Road, once dismissed as exhausted of clues, was suddenly crawling with investigators again. Yellow tape looped around the front porch. County deputies moved carefully through the attic with gloved hands and whispered radio calls. Evidence markers dotted the plywood room. Forensics teams collected hair, bone fragments, and dust samples, while cameras documented every square inch of the sealed space. Detective Lucas Mallory, now one of the lead investigators for cold cases statewide, arrived before dusk. He stood in the attic doorway with the same expression he'd worn 12 years earlier when the second letter arrived. Not shock, not relief, but grim confirmation. The remains were photographed, bagged, and sent to the state lab. The metal box was placed in a sealed evidence container, though Claire had already seen what was inside. A stack of handwritten pages, some smeared, some torn, but legible. A diary, dated June and July of 2006. There were no lights left on in the farmhouse that night, just the sound of the attic being unmade, one nail at a time. By the next morning, the case was officially reopened. Press conferences were prepared. The public was notified. Forensic anthropologists began reconstructing the timeline. And Claire sat on the porch with her son, staring at the attic window, now propped open for the first time in nearly 2 decades. The town of Shallow Creek had always whispered about what might have happened inside that house, but no one expected the answer to have been there the entire time, just beyond a sealed door, buried in still air and time-thick dust. The diary inside the box was smaller than expected. A soft, leather-bound journal with frayed edges, its cover nearly split down the spine. The first few pages were stuck together, warped from moisture and time, but most of it remained intact, page after page in the same tight, looping cursive that had once signed birthday cards and grocery lists. The ink had faded in places, and a few entries ended mid-thought, as if the pen had paused, then never returned. For the investigators, it was evidence. For Claire, it was something closer to a confession, not of guilt, but of what had gone unseen. The entries began on June 12, 2006, one day after Mildred Lake was reported missing. It's quiet now. I've brought enough water for 3 days and dried apples to stretch through the weekend. I don't think he suspects anything. The writing was deliberate, almost calm. She mentioned the attic as if it were a known hiding place, describing how she'd reinforced the latch from inside and stuffed towels under the cracks to block light and sound. She wrote about Dennis, not with rage, but with fear that built in small, careful lines. He was pacing again last night. Through the toaster. Said I'd been watching him too closely. I didn't say a word. I just nodded. The next entries painted a quiet horror. He started locking the basement door again. I asked why, and he stared at me. Just stared. Another. Found the fridge open when I came in from the garden. Every jar smashed. I cleaned it before he woke. My hands are still shaking. She wrote about the bruises, how she'd been falling more often, how the town accepted it because old women fall, and she made sure her makeup always covered what it needed to. There were no threats recorded directly, no admissions of violence, just the escalation of fear. The way his moods changed like weather, how he would apologize, then go silent for days. How some nights he stood outside her bedroom door, just breathing. By the second week, the entries grew shorter. The air in the attic had become stifling. Food was running low. She wrote that she only came down once at night to refill water and check that the back door was still unlocked. He sleeps heavier now. I think the drinking's worse. If I time it right, I can be gone before dawn. She mentioned a suitcase hidden in the root cellar, packed weeks earlier. Said she had enough saved to reach Indiana's southern line, maybe a motel near the bus station. Claire's letters are in the box. I've marked the bills and packed my coat. I will not die in this house. But something shifted in the final entries. The tone turned brittle. The handwriting is less precise. She mentioned noises in the house, hearing Dennis call out once, her name drawn long like a question. He knows. I think he knows. He hasn't left in 2 days. He keeps walking from room to room. I don't think he's looking for me. I think he's waiting. There's no mention of confrontation, no sign she tried to leave after that point, only a growing awareness that time was running out. The final entry was dated July 8th. The heat is heavy today. I feel dizzy. No more apples, water is low. If he comes up, I don't think I can stop him. If he doesn't, I need to try again tonight. I'm not sure I'll make it. If someone finds this, tell Claire I'm sorry I didn't try sooner. Tell her I loved her. The entry ended with a broken line, the pen dragging off the edge of the paper. Forensic analysts estimated she had died within days of that last note. Dehydration and heat stroke were likely factors. There were signs she had attempted to pry open the latch herself, faint scratch marks on the inside wood, shallow and uneven. But the latch had held. It was never designed to be permanent, just enough to keep the door from shifting open, enough to trap someone who couldn't find the strength to undo it. The diary was authenticated by handwriting experts. It matched every sample available, from church sign-in sheets to her handwritten pie recipes. It wasn't a forgery. It wasn't a trick. Mildred Lake had hidden herself in the attic to escape the man she feared most, and in doing so, she sealed her fate. The revelation shattered any lingering hope that her disappearance had been random, that she had walked away into the woods or run off to start anew. She had stayed. She had tried. And the truth had been sitting above everyone's heads for 16 years. Investigators searched the house again, top to bottom. They found nothing else. No signs Dennis had ever entered the attic after it was sealed. No fingerprints on the inner latch. But his silence, his refusal to revisit that door, it now held a weight no one could ignore. The diary was released to Claire after the evidence review. She didn't speak to reporters, didn't give interviews. She simply held the small book in her hands and said, she wrote it for someone to find. And now someone had. But the full truth, the years of isolation, the slow terror that drove Mildred to hide in the place no one would look, still lingered in the air of that farmhouse, not in screams or violence, but in silence, in the kind that builds, unchecked, behind closed doors and tight-latched rooms. The forensic report arrived 3 weeks after the remains were recovered. It was precise, clinical, and in places quietly devastating. Mildred Lake had died in early July of 2006, likely between the 9th and 12th, less than a month after she vanished. The cause, a combination of severe dehydration, malnutrition, and environmental stress. There were no signs of trauma, no broken bones, no ligature marks, nothing violent. She hadn't been struck or strangled. She hadn't been smothered. Her death had not been fast. What they found instead were subtler details: fingernail damage, soft tissue impressions on bone, claw marks beneath the attic doorframe that matched the width of her fingers. Shallow at first, then deeper. She had tried, in the final days, to get out. Her nails had cracked against the wood. The skin on her hands had torn. The final struggle was quiet, but desperate. Not against a person, but against time, thirst, and a simple latch that had sealed shut from the outside. Experts explained the physiology, how the human body can last around 3 days without water in summer heat, less if exertion is involved. How cognitive decline sets in, leading to confusion, hallucinations, then unconsciousness. Mildred would have grown weak, likely disoriented, before slipping into unconsciousness. The insulation in the makeshift attic room had trapped heat. There was no cross-ventilation, no airflow. She had suffocated slowly in dry air and silence. Her own refuge had become a tomb. Investigators pieced together the timeline. The diary confirmed that she had been planning to leave, not impulsively, but methodically. She had stored food, water, and essential supplies in the attic over time, probably hidden gradually, in pockets of laundry baskets or within boxes. She had mapped out a route. She had cash, a bag ready in the root cellar. Her escape was real, but so was her fear. Every entry pointed to a deep, escalating sense of danger, not from strangers, but from the man who lived downstairs. Dennis. He'd claimed he didn't know where she went, that she had probably wandered off, that old women do that. His alibi had always held. But now the question wasn't whether he'd killed her. It was whether he had let her die. The attic latch had been installed inside the doorframe, at the top. A crude mechanism, not factory-made, a strip of the wood fixed with screws and a hook-style latch meant to keep the door from drifting open. It couldn't be reached easily from inside, not without a tool or enough leverage to push upward while turning the knob. Claire remembered the latch. She remembered Dennis brushing off her concern when she mentioned it as a teenager. "It's just storage," he'd said. "Nothing up there but dust and squirrels." Investigators now believed that sometime after Mildred went into hiding, maybe that very night, Dennis had noticed the attic door cracked or ajar. Maybe he heard something. Maybe he just got suspicious. Maybe he thought it was nothing. But he latched it. Whether out of habit, instinct, or something darker, he closed her in. And he never opened it again. There was no surveillance, no confession, no direct evidence that he knew she was up there. But the circumstantial weight was heavy. He had lived in the house for 6 more months before moving out. He never reopened the attic, never mentioned hearing anything. When questioned during the original investigation, he'd said the attic had been locked for years. That was a lie, or at best, a deflection. The district attorney reviewed the case, but with Dennis deceased, there would be no charges, no trial, no confrontation. Claire was left with the awful reality that the person her grandmother had feared most had outlived her by nearly 2 decades and had died without ever being held accountable. It was possible Dennis never knew, but it was also possible he had. And either way, the result was the same. A woman who had lived her life in service to her family died alone, above their heads, waiting for a rescue that never came. News of the discovery spread fast. Mildred Lake's name returned to headlines, this time with finality. Reporters used words like grisly, tragic, and unthinkable. But what made it hardest for Claire wasn't the horror, it was the slowness of it, the idea that her grandmother had suffered not from violence, but from abandonment, that she had believed until the very end that someone might open that door. The town mourned publicly. Memorial services were held. A plaque was placed at the local church. But beneath the gestures, an uncomfortable truth lingered. People had suspected something. They had whispered for years about Raymond, about Dennis, about the bruises, the locked doors, the quiet looks. And still, No one had opened that attic. In the end, Mildred Lake was buried beside her husband per the original plot purchased decades before. Claire attended the burial in silence, standing between rows of stone, her son's hand in hers. She said nothing. Just listened to the wind in the trees, the same wind her grandmother must have heard through the thin attic vent while she waited to be found. After the forensic investigation ended, after the reporters left and the yellow tape came down, the farmhouse on Willow Road stood quietly again, not as a crime scene, not as an active investigation site, but as something else entirely. A monument, a warning, a place that had held a secret for 19 years, without ever giving it away. Claire didn't sell it. She never listed it. She never moved back in either. She kept it standing, intact, room by room, just as it had been the day they opened the attic. Some said she was protecting it. Others said she simply couldn't bring herself to let it go. She had the attic preserved, not cleaned, not remodeled, preserved. The plywood walls remained standing, the mattress left as it was, the old thermos, the enamel basin, the blankets, all sealed behind a transparent barrier installed by a local historical society at Claire's request. A single plaque was mounted near the attic door, small and bronze, engraved with a single line from Mildred's final diary entry. "I hope someone will forgive me." No name, no dates, just those words. For the people of Shallow Creek, it changed the shape of memory. Mildred Lake had been a familiar face, the kind of person whose disappearance was tragic, but quietly explained away over time. A lost elder, a woman who may have wandered or been taken or simply chosen to leave. Her face had faded from bulletin boards, her name from news segments, but now she was something else. A figure not lost to time or terrain, but hidden in the one place no one thought to look. Visitors came. Not many, and not loudly, but enough to keep the gate from rusting shut. Some were family from neighboring counties. Others were strangers who'd read about the case online, who stood at the base of the stairs and looked up at the attic door, imagining what it must have been like to be that close and not know. A few wept. Some left notes. Once, someone taped a single white lily to the wall beside the plaque with a strip of masking tape. No one touched it. The house itself became quiet in a new way. The walls, still bowed and cracked from years of heat and cold, seemed to carry the weight of what they'd held. The kitchen clock still hung above the stove, stopped at 3:14. The floorboards still creaked under the same spots. But the house no longer felt like just a building. It felt like a story that had been trying to tell itself for years, and finally had. People in town talked about it differently now, not as gossip, as grief. They talked about how many times they'd driven past and never wondered what might be sealed inside, how easy it had been to accept the simplest explanation, that she'd left, that she was gone. A few admitted to having doubts about Dennis. One woman said she'd once seen Mildred wincing as she loaded groceries and hadn't offered to help. Another said she'd heard shouting once but turned up the TV. It wasn't guilt they carried, not exactly. It was the echo of missed chances. The sheriff's office issued a final statement. No charges would ever be filed, no posthumous indictments, no legal action. The death had been ruled accidental, brought on by isolation and confinement. But off the record, many believed differently. That Dennis had known, that he had sealed the door and chosen not to open it. That silence had been his answer. And that silence, in the end, had been fatal. Claire rarely spoke about it. When asked why she hadn't sold the house, she only said, "It belongs to her more than it ever belonged to any of us." She kept living in Fort Wayne, raising Dylan, who now told people, quietly and without fear, that his great-grandmother had lived in an attic. Not like a ghost, he said, just hidden, just waiting. To this day, the farmhouse remains, paint peeling, porch sagging. The attic is latched open now, with a small light installed so visitors can see inside without stepping in. Some nights, neighbors still claim they hear sounds, a low creak, a shifting board, something too steady to be wind. They don't say it's haunted, not exactly. They say the house remembers, that it groans not from age but from memory. The kind of memory that doesn't fade with time. The kind that lives in wood and walls and the quiet space just above where everyone used to sit and eat breakfast, because Mildred Lake didn't vanish without a trace. She left the room. A diary. A silence so complete it took nearly 2 decades to break. And now that it has, what remains is not just the pain of what happened, but the ache of what went unheard. A woman who lived above the living, waiting for someone to open a door. And now that it's open, the town will never quite close it again.